I fear that in the Trump administration, there is not a recognition of what's at stake in this war, that there's not a recognition that if Russia wins, Russia becomes a much bigger threat. So I worry that, for example, the Trump administration may not be prepared to continue the kinds of assistance that the United States has provided over the past 3 years.
This is the Expert Series podcast from the CDA Institute, Canada's premier defense and security think tank. I'm Josh Malm, and it's Tuesday, July 22nd, 2025.
I will prevent, and very easily, World War III, very easily. Before I even arrive at the Oval Office, I will have the disastrous war between Russia and Ukraine settled.
But you've now been in office for 5 months and 5 days. Why have you not been able to end the Ukraine war?
Because it's more difficult than people would have any idea.
The war in Ukraine isn't just a regional conflict. It's a pivotal struggle over the future of liberal democracy, Western unity, and global power. With Russia pursuing its expansionist aims, the West divided, and President Donald Trump reshaping U.S. foreign policy, the outcome of the Ukraine war could determine whether democratic values or authoritarian spheres of influence define the next few decades. Stephen Pifer and Angela Stent joined us this week to unpack the evolving stakes of the war in Ukraine and its broader geopolitical consequences, drawing on their deep expertise in U.S. Russia relations and European security. They discussed the latest developments of the Ukraine war, Russia's rising influence, ambitions, and pursuit of spheres of influence foreign policy, the impact of Donald Trump's return to the White House on America's positioning on the war and European security more broadly, and how the war's outcomes could reshape NATO cohesion, the broader international security landscape, and the potential emergence of a multipolar world order. Both of our guests today are with Brookings. Angela Stent is a senior fellow with Brookings, and Stephen Pifer is a non-resident senior fellow. Today's episode is hosted by my good colleague and CDAI research assistant, Gabrielle Picton. This week's episode is a pre-recorded interview that was held back in mid-May of this year. While that's now a few months away, the analysis and discussions are still incredibly timely and relevant, and we'll return next week with timelier analysis on more recent events, developments, and issues.
After May 10th summit of the Coalition of the Willing, President Zelensky announced his willingness to meet Russian President Vladimir Putin for direct talks in Istanbul, contingent on a 30-day ceasefire being agreed to. Can you begin with your assessment of what this means for the state of the war?
So, from Putin's point of view, he really has no interest in ending this war at the moment. He believes that that Russia is doing quite well on the battlefield, that the Ukrainians are on the defensive, that there is war fatigue in Ukraine, and that the Europeans, even though we did have a very successful meeting of the Coalition of the Willing in Kiev, but that the Europeans are really not united on what should happen. And there are certain countries like Hungary, like Slovakia, who don't support Ukraine. So from his point of view, agreeing to a ceasefire is really something that he has rejected since it was first mooted by the Trump administration and, of course, by President Zelensky, too. And so in response, Putin, in response to the Coalition of the Willing's suggestion that there should be a 30-day ceasefire prior to any negotiations, which at that point President Trump had apparently agreed to, in response to that, he said, no, we're going to have direct bilateral talks. And so immediately President Trump seized on that and said, yes, there should be bilateral talks and Zelensky must agree to this. President Zelensky did agree to it. But what was not clear was who would be at these bilateral talks. And what is clear is that there is absolutely no Russian interest in having a 30-day ceasefire. So I would say that despite all the various negotiators going from the United States to Russia, to Ukraine, and despite the Europeans increasingly focusing on this with the new German chancellor and also having talks with the Ukrainians, despite all of that, I don't think that we're any nearer to resolving this war and to a peace settlement than we were on January the 19th before President Trump was inaugurated.
To shift our focus now to the other side of the Atlantic and dive a bit more into the new U.S. administration, how has the re-election of Donald Trump to the U.S. presidency impacted proceedings towards a peace settlement?
So before President Trump was inaugurated, the Biden administration had been working closely with Ukraine. It had been providing them with weapons, with financial support, and with some logistical support, although one might argue not enough weapons to enable Ukraine to win the war, but also enough so that it didn't lose the war. What you did not have in the Biden administration is that after the June 2021 summit between President Biden and President Putin, there was very little contact and then no contact between the two leaders. So the only high-level contacts between the U.S. and Russia that existed for most of the Trump administration, at least after the summer of 2021, were occasional communications between the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, and his then counterpart, Mr. Patrushev. You had contacts between the director of the Central Intelligence Agency, Bill Burns, and his counterpart in Russia. And you had a couple of meetings between Secretary of State Blinken and Foreign Minister Lavrov, not direct bilateral talks, but at other venues. So what changed when President Trump came in was the immediate revival of discussions with Russia. And I think what we have to understand here is there are two tracks in the U.S.-Russian negotiations. One track does have to do with ending the war in Ukraine, and Trump's personal special advisor, Stephen Witkoff, a businessman, not a diplomat, has been conducting those. But probably more important for both President Trump and President Putin is the move to reset Russian relations, to improve them. The prospect of lifting sanctions on Russia and that there being a number of lucrative business deals in the future, the prospect of strategic stability talks with Russia on what comes after the New START agreement that regulates strategic nuclear weapons after it expires in 2026. All this is unprecedented because this is reviving a relationship in the middle of a war. But those are the two tracks. And the U.S.-Russian bilateral track also restoring some of the diplomatic ties that have been severed since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The U.S. has a very minimal presence diplomatically in Russia now, and the Russians lost two recreational facilities that they had outside Washington and outside New York. So those talks are going on, and they will probably continue irrespective of whether there are peace talks, whether those peace talks succeed or not. And then the third track we have under President Trump is a U.S.-Ukrainian separate track with General Keith Kellogg as the Trump administration special envoy for Ukraine. But he is not talking to the Russians because they essentially refuse to talk to him. And one issue with these three tracks is how much communication there is, particularly on the ceasefire and peace front between the U.S. Ukrainian and U.S. Russian track. But we're now in a very different situation than we were before President Trump was inaugurated because the Biden administration had essentially severed most ties with Russia.
Considering these recent changes in the U.S., what do you anticipate Canada's role as the only North American partner within a potential post-peace coalition of the willing be? If not Canada specifically, what might a peace deal mean for the role of middle powers in the international system?
Well, I think if we're talking about Canada's role, it would then, with the other European members of NATO, provide a number of different levels of support for Ukraine. Financial support. Some of the European countries are certainly providing weapons for Ukraine to continue to support it after the war is over, when it ends, to deter another Russian invasion. That's the main reason for it. Canada could do what the European members of NATO are pledged to do, which is to provide security guarantees for Ukraine once the war is over, possibly troops in a stabilization force that would be stationed in Western Ukraine and would be there. It's not really a peacekeeping force, but at least to try and monitor whether if there were a permanent ceasefire, whether that were being honored or not. And I think for other middle powers, there might be a role in participating in Ukraine's reconstruction. Canada could certainly do that too, in terms of, the enormous damage that has been done to Ukraine in helping its reconstruction, rebuilding things.
We've spoken about this a bit already in regards to the Biden administration and U.S. Russia bilateral relations, but I'm wondering if you can elaborate a bit further on what America's posture is now vis-a-vis Ukraine, and how and why does it continue to contrast with that of years prior?
So we do know that President Trump himself does not have a very positive view of President Zelensky. This goes back to the first impeachment trial of President Trump in his first administration, when someone leaked the contents of a conversation that he had with Zelensky, trying to pressure him to find "quote unquote" dirt on President Biden and his son, in return, and saying that U.S. assistance would not be forthcoming to Ukraine unless President Zelensky did that. Well, as a result of the leaking of this phone call, there was an impeachment trial. He was not convicted by the Senate, but his attitude towards President Zelensky is certainly rather complicated. And what we've seen since he's come into office is that his special envoy for Ukraine has largely repeated the narratives that Putin has given him on why the war broke out, and what could be done, and why NATO is seen as a threat to Russia. And so even though we now have a somewhat better relationship between President Trump and President Zelensky, since President Zelensky met with President Trump briefly at the Pope's funeral and then signed a minerals and economic agreement with the U.S., where the U.S. will participate with Ukraine in excavating its rare earth, its minerals, and oil and gas. But we have to remember that in February, you had the showdown in the Oval Office when both President Trump and Vice President Vance reprimanded Zelensky for things that he had said. It was probably an unprecedented public show of an argument in the White House. So the relationship with Ukraine, I would say, is very complicated. And whenever there's a chance, Ukraine gets criticized for things, and Russia is rarely criticized by President Trump for anything. And that, of course, is very different from what happened in the Biden administration.
To continue this through line of exploring the evolving state of Russia-U.S. relations further, based upon the second Trump administration's rejection of once traditional allies, can we anticipate Russia attempting to use this new dynamic to raise its global standing post-war? How and why might this take place?
Well, Russia has already raised its global standing since the war began, because what we've seen is that no country in the global south has sanctioned Russia. Many of those countries have continued to talk to Russia, and many of those countries have repeated the Russian narrative about why the war broke out. And for many of these countries, their unwillingness to criticize Russia and their willingness to do business with Russia has to do also with their rather critical view of the United States. So we have seen since the war began, more and more countries wanting to join the BRICS, and some have already joined, and then more in the pipeline. And we have seen this unwillingness to criticize Russia. Then we've also seen an increased Russian presence in Africa since the war began, and a revival of Russian fortunes in parts of the Middle East. Although one of the things, of course, that's happened since the war began is that President Assad in Syria, of course, was defeated by the opposition forces. Russia had supported President Assad since 2015, and it's in danger of losing both its air base and its naval base in Syria, although it's still trying to negotiate with a new government. And that was, I think, a direct result of the war with Ukraine, because the Russians couldn't give as much support to Syria. But I would say that we've seen Russia raise its profile in some ways internationally since this war began.
To shift back to Russia a bit more specifically, what drives Putin's expansionism? What does his strategy indicate that he wants for Russia in the short and in the long term?
So Vladimir Putin has never accepted the collapse of the Soviet Union. That's true of course, many other Russians of his generation. But don't forget, he was a mid-level KGB case officer in Dresden, East Germany, when the wall came down. He did not live in the Soviet Union during the Gorbachev period, when there was, of course, an opening up of society and a reassessment of Russia's foreign policy goals. And so he as early as the 1990s, he was telling Westerners who we met that he did not accept the collapse of the Soviet Union. So as time has gone on, he sees himself more and more in the tradition of Peter the Great and other Russian czars, Catherine the Great, who, of course, took Crimea during her term as Tsarina. And he sees himself as the restorer, the gatherer of Russian lands, as previous czars have done. And so he has been determined for some time to reassert Russia's influence over the post-Soviet states and possibly create, for instance, a Slavic state consisting of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, and possibly northern Kazakhstan. Now, with regard to Ukraine, he does not believe that the Ukrainians are a separate nationality. He believes that they and Russia belongs together. He does not believe that Ukraine has a right to be a separate state. And in the 5,000-word essay he penned in 2021, explaining why Ukraine wasn't a separate nationality and should not be a separate state, he blamed Lenin for the existence of an independent Ukrainian state, because Lenin had created the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic after the Bolshevik Revolution to give the illusion that these states, other republics of the Soviet Union, had some autonomy. And so this drive to expansion has been there for a long time. The question is, depending on how the Ukraine war ends, would he then set his sights on other former Soviet states? If you go back to the so-called draft treaties that were presented to the United States and to NATO in December of 2021, it was clear that he not only sees the former Soviet states as part of the Russian sphere of influence, but also the former Warsaw Pact states, because he was demanding that NATO retreat to where it was in 1997 before the first enlargement. So I would say, as long as he is in power, this drive to expansionism, this belief that Russia has a right to dominate its neighbors, and that the West has to accept that, this is going to continue.
How does his relationship with President Trump factor into his decision-making process?
Well, I think he's been very successful in persuading President Trump that he wants to have a good relationship with him, that President Trump can achieve something by improving the relationship. This was already happening during Trump's first term. For whatever reasons, President Trump has always admired Russia. He first went to the Soviet Union in its dying days in 1987 and was interested in doing business deals there. But we can see that he admires President Putin. He admires strongmen. And President Putin, as I said before, is a former KGB case officer, and he understands really quite well how to play Trump. He's been very successful in doing that. And even though, whatever you read by other Russian officials, and if you listen to what Putin was saying before Trump was inaugurated, Russia sees the West, NATO, and the United States as its number one enemy. Putin's rhetoric has changed on this since President Trump came into office, even though that of his close officials has not changed.
As a result of the changes in Russia and the U.S. we've discussed, and the framework currently been presented for the peace deal in Ukraine, Could you assess if the international community is moving towards a Yalta-type system of spheres of influence? And what might this mean for the security of small states like Ukraine?
So I don't think the international community is moving towards a Yalta-type system. But we know that's what Putin wants, and he's praised Yalta several times, beginning in 2015, saying the Yalta system kept the peace for many decades. And what Putin is now arguing for is a tripartite Yalta system where the world is divided into spheres of influence between Russia, the United States, and China. The United States itself, under President Trump, and this is again a major change, President Trump doesn't seem to like allies. He thinks allies take advantage of the United States. You know, of course, what he said about Canada becoming the 51st state, but he has also criticized the Europeans for in essence, exploiting the United States and taking money from it and not having their fair share of the burden of an alliance. So he's really walking away and undoing an alliance system which the U.S. created after World War II and has been very successful. And I think the other thing about both President Putin and President Trump is Putin has always said that he believes there are only 3 or 4 truly sovereign states: Russia, China, the United States, possibly India. And all other states have limited sovereignty. They're small states and they have limited sovereignty. And I think in many ways this is Donald Trump's worldview too. I don't think that he really believes in the concept of sovereignty for smaller states. He certainly appears not to believe in that necessarily for Ukraine. And so I think that's where the world might be, the direction in which it might be moving. Now, for the rest of the world, probably the idea of a multilateral global or multipolar global order is what we're going to see in the future instead of one dominated by the United States. But a multipolar world order is different from a Yalta order.
Looking forward into the potential post-war period, if the peace settlement for the war in Ukraine leans towards appeasing Russia, will Putin target the West again in the future?
So I think if Russia comes out of this war having gained most of what it wanted, and we still don't know how the war is going to end, I think possibly its next focus, Russia's next focus, would be some of the weaker post-Soviet states. I would say particularly Moldova. You already see it happening in Georgia, Georgia that's moving much closer to Russia than it was before. And then Russia might set its sights on some of the former Warsaw Pact members that are also NATO members, like Romania. I mean, we've seen Russian interference in Romania's domestic politics very much last year. The winning of an election by an unknown far-right candidate supported by Russia. Romania is redoing the elections, but I think there's a lot of vulnerability in Romania, for instance, to Russian penetration. But that's true of a number of Warsaw Pact states, and it's also true of Western European states. You see Russian disinformation, Russian sabotage, Russian propaganda becoming much more active there, supporting pro-Russian parties in a number of these countries. So there are different kinds of expansion. They don't only have to be military. They can be done also through these other means. I'm sure that will continue.
Ultimately, if Russia is to emerge victorious in Ukraine, would this legitimize its sphere of influence in the post-Soviet region?
I think if it emerges victorious from Ukraine, it will then certainly continue pursuing policies designed to restore a sphere of influence in the post-Soviet space. And again, if you have the United States, and of course a China as well, that are themselves quite willing to see a future world order that is more like a Yalta-type system, then I think that would facilitate Russia doing that.
Could you assess the state of Ukrainian and Russian forces in the present moment, considering the ongoing discussions surrounding a potential peace deal?
Yeah, I mean, I think Russia has certain advantages of size. They've been able to mobilize more manpower, and of course, they're drawing on a larger economy. Um, and I think some people, though, overestimate, though, the state of Russia's military. So in 2024, over the course of that year, the Russians captured about 1,600 square miles of Ukrainian territory, which sounds like a lot, but it's well under 1% of Ukraine's total landmass. Someone calculated at this rate it would take the Russians 100 years to capture all of Ukraine. So I think it goes a little bit too far to say that the Russians are on a winning path. Now, I'm not saying Ukraine is winning. Ukraine faces some difficult situations, but the Ukrainian military is fighting on the defensive. So in many cases, they're fighting from prepared defensive positions, which gives them certain advantages. And also, I think Ukraine has motivation. Ukrainians see this war as existential. If they lose, they know Ukraine, the kind of Ukraine that they would like to have, is gone. And I think that counts for a lot when they're fighting with Russian soldiers who largely appear to be unmotivated.
Now, in terms of the peace deal itself, which of the key actors at the present moment stands to benefit most from the conditions that have been proposed?
Well, it's hard to say because it's not clear which peace deal you're talking about. It seems to me that in terms of a settlement, the two biggest issues are territory and security guarantees. Russia now occupies about 19% of Ukraine's territory. President Zelensky has indicated that Ukraine would be prepared to accept a ceasefire in place. And I think he's also said over the course of the last year that he would be prepared to agree not to use military force to recover that territory. So he's accepted, at least for some period of time, Russian occupation of part of Ukraine. But he's also made clear, and I think this is very understandable, that he wants to have a very solid security guarantee for Ukraine. Because he doesn't want to reach a settlement now and then 2 years down the road, the Russians, after they've regenerated military capability, launch another war. So he's looking at a security guarantee. Ideally, he would like NATO membership. I think NATO membership would be the best guarantee for Ukraine's security, but it's at this point, there's not yet a consensus within the alliance for that. There's talk about having some NATO members provide boots on the ground, a reassurance force. There's also talk about the West providing Ukraine a lot of military capability, a lot of weapons, and then Ukraine has a large standing army that would deter future Russian attack. But I think there's got to be that balance, territory, but on the other hand, from the point of view of Zelensky, and I think it's understandable, he wants a solid guarantee that this settlement brings the war to an end. And right now, I mean, well, I think Zelensky and the Ukrainian side, they have compromised. I mean, they're prepared at least to accept temporarily, and not importantly, not de jure recognition, but temporarily Russian occupation of Ukrainian territory. You've seen absolutely no movement by the Russian side. And I think it really raises serious questions about the Russians, whether they're interested in trying to find a settlement. What we saw play out over the last 5 days between Moscow and Kyiv suggests to me that the Russians are not interested in trying to find a settlement, at least not a settlement that is on terms other than Russian demands. And if you look at Russian demands, those really amount to Ukraine's complete capitulation.
I'm interested now if we can continue to explore this through line of Russia wanting a settlement or wanting peace on their terms. So if you can dive a bit more into the recent ceasefire of 3 days proposed around Victory Day, was this respected by Russia? And if so, or if not, what do the ramifications of this spell for the conflict in the short term?
Yeah, well, I actually happened to be in Kyiv last week, so I was there for the first couple of days. I think what you saw is at least missile attacks and drone attacks on Kyiv were halted for those 3 days. So I was there on Tuesday, which would have been the 5th. There were attacks on Kyiv throughout the night of the 5th and 6th, but the 8th and the 9th. Actually, let me see that. I've got my dates wrong there. But whatever the Tuesday was that week, that would have been, perhaps the 6th. There were, for example, 3 air raids between midnight and 7 a.m. on Wednesday, which would have been the 7th of May. However, there were no air raids while I was there the 8th and 9th. I left late in the evening on the 9th, and I understand no raids on the 10th. Now, let's bear in mind why Russia offered that ceasefire. Russia did not want to have any Ukrainian attacks against Moscow, spoiling Vladimir Putin's big parade on May 9. However, there were attacks reported and fighting along the line of contact. I think it was reduced, but it was not a complete ceasefire from what the Ukrainians reported. But again, I don't see this as a major offer by Putin to try to end the war. This was Putin simply trying to buy 3 days of quiet so he could go ahead and stage his big Victory in Europe Day parade without any interruption from the Ukrainian side.
Returning now to the sets of potential peace deal conditions proposed by each side, could you elaborate on the issues posed if Russian ownership over the 5 regions, that being Crimea, Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson, is recognized? Particularly if a NATO perspective for Ukraine is not confirmed, what does this mean for the future of the European and transatlantic security architectures?
Yeah, well, I think let's break the pieces up. I mean, the Ukrainians have said that they're prepared to accept, for some period anyway, de facto Russian occupation of the parts of Ukraine, Crimea, Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson, although the Russians do not occupy all of those pieces. So, for example, they still don't occupy substantial portions of Kherson, Zaporizhia, or Donetsk. They've said the Ukrainians are prepared to accept that on a de facto basis, and their goal would be to use political and diplomatic means to try to regain control of those. But the Ukrainians have also been adamant that they will not agree to de jure legal recognition of those territories as part of Russia. And I think that's understandable. I mean, it would contradict the Ukrainian constitution. And it would, forcing Ukraine really to accept the permanent loss of those territories when there might well be at some point political and diplomatic means by which Ukraine could secure their return at some future point. We don't know what's going to happen in the future. So I think that that's important for the Ukrainians, and I think the West should back that idea of not de jure recognizing these territories as Russian. I mean, it really goes to the heart of what I think is a key international principle here. It is not to the West's advantage to recognize Russia's use of military force to grab territory from neighboring states. We should do nothing to normalize that because, the Russians may try it again. I'm not sure that Vladimir Putin's ambitions end with Ukraine. So I think, that's the problem about de facto versus de jure recognition of the occupied territories. And what it means, I think, more broadly for NATO, again, I think NATO, as I said, the West has an interest in not accepting, not recognizing their incorporation into Russia, because we don't want to legitimize this idea that the Russians seem to have that you can use military force to change borders that you do not like. But I think there's also a practical reason is moving in that direction. If you encourage Russia, if you embolden Russia, does Russia then present a greater threat to NATO and to transatlantic security? And quite frankly, that's a concern that I have, that is Vladimir Putin prevails in Ukraine and either wins on the battlefield or wins because of a shoddy peace deal. Is he then emboldened? And then with time to regenerate his military, does he pose a threat to other countries on Russia's border? And I think NATO needs to be concerned about that.
I'd like to shift focus now to look more closely at the dynamics of Western support for Ukraine. Can we trace the reservation of the United States to provide military security guarantees for Ukraine back to the Budapest Memorandum? Can you elaborate further on how this and the trilateral agreement process may have set a pattern on the limits of Western support or intervention on Ukraine's behalf?
Yeah. Well, if you go back to, over 30 years ago, neither the George H.W. Bush administration nor the Clinton administration were prepared to extend a military guarantee to Ukraine. And by military guarantee, I mean a commitment like we have with NATO members, which is if you are attacked by a foreign power, the American military is going to come to your assistance. And there's a calculation. I think in both the Bush and the Clinton administrations, they said even if we would want to do this, would you get, that kind of guarantee normally requires a treaty confirmation by the Senate. Would the Senate be prepared to support that? And I think in both administrations, they said there's no way the Senate would be prepared to support this. So that's a very important reason why the Budapest Memorandum was the memorandum of security assurances, not guarantees. In negotiating the language, and I was part of that negotiation, we told our Ukrainian counterparts, the Ukrainians, the memorandum says Russia, the United States, and Britain commit to respect Ukraine's sovereignty, its territorial integrity, its independence, and they commit not to use force or threaten to use force against Ukraine. And there are a couple of other commitments as well. The memorandum, though, does not commit the United States and Britain to come to Ukraine's military aid if Russia violates it. And that's an important piece that wasn't there. Now, in the negotiating, when we were working on the language, the Ukrainians asked us, what will you Americans do if the Russians violate the commitments? And we said, we will take an interest, we will do things. We said, however, we're going to be clear, we're telling you now the 82nd Airborne is not coming to your assistance. We're not sending American troops, but we'll do things. Now, we didn't have, back in 1993 and 1994, a detailed conversation about exactly what the United States would do. And I think that was due to a mistake both in Washington, but also in Kyiv, is neither side really foresaw what Vladimir Putin did in 2014 when he seized Crimea, or in 2022 when he launched the all-out invasion. I think had that been the case, the Ukrainians likely would have balked this whole question and might have tried to retain some nuclear weapons. And it would have been a very different course in history. But we gave assurances to the Ukrainians. Quite frankly, I was critical of the Obama administration in 2014 and 2015 after Russia seized Crimea, because I think the United States should have done more to help Ukraine. And while I wish the Biden administration had done more from 2022 to 2024, I'm also, the $120 billion in American military assistance and other types of assistance, that's a pretty significant chunk of support. Plus, the United States also led the effort under the Biden administration to isolate Putin. That was consistent with, I think, the sorts of assurances we gave the Ukrainians 30 years ago. So I'm comfortable we lived up to the words there, although I'm not sure exactly where the Trump administration is going.
Now, looking more towards the present-day context of the current administration, regarding the stalled state of current negotiations, Vice President J.D. Vance was recently quoted as saying his administration thinks Russia is asking for too much in terms of concessions to end the conflict. In contrast to his posture at the Munich Security Conference months earlier, what does this mean for the U.S.'s posture towards the war?
Well, I think the Vice President's assessment is correct. Again, if you look at the positions of the two sides over the last 3 years, Russian negotiating demands have, if anything, hardened. They've become tougher over the last 3 years. Ukraine, I believe, has shown some flexibility in being prepared to accept a ceasefire and being prepared to accept at least temporary occupation of Ukrainian territory by the Russian military. And the Russians, there was a reported American proposal about a month ago into which the United States would have recognized Crimea de jure as Russian territory, would have recognized Russian de facto occupation of Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Luhansk, would have agreed that there would be no NATO membership for Ukraine, would have agreed to lift sanctions on Russia. I thought it was a fairly one-sided proposal in Russia's favor, and I thought it was a proposal that likely was not going to be acceptable to the Ukrainians, and I think likely the Europeans would have objected as well. And even the Russians came out and said, well, that proposal wasn't enough. So you've got two very different positions. It's good that the vice president recognizes that the Russians are demanding too much. I would hope that would translate, particularly after what's happened in the last 5 days. So on Saturday, President Zelensky meets with the leaders of Britain, France, Germany, and Poland, and they issue a call for immediate ceasefire, followed by negotiations. And they say, but if Russia does not agree to that ceasefire, there should then be sanctions. President Trump reportedly agreed to that. The next day, Putin says, well, no ceasefire, but we'll have direct negotiations. And then Trump says, well, let's have direct negotiations. So Trump kind of broke ranks with the Saturday position. Then Zelensky says, okay, I'm prepared for direct negotiations. I will accept the offer from Putin. I'll meet him in Istanbul on Thursday, May 15. And almost immediately the Russians say, well, no. Putin's not going to meet with Zelensky. And then, Trump's suggesting he would be prepared to take part in the negotiations. Secretary of State Marco Rubio is headed for Europe. And then it turns out Foreign Minister Lavrov is not going to come. So at some point, there needs to be a recognition by the Trump administration that the Russians are gaming the West and they're gaming Ukraine. They're playing a game here. And I think it suggests that, or actually not more than suggests, it makes it very clear, Moscow at this point in time is not interested in seriously negotiating the end of this war. The Russians want to continue this war. Putin seems to believe that, time will favor the Russian side. I think he may not be correct in that assessment. But what's happened, and I think it's frustrating to me, is I believe the Trump administration has been gamed quite successfully by the Russians. So over the last 3 months, what you've seen from the Trump administration are what I would call a series of carrots, a series of concessions to the Russians. So agreeing back in February to meet with Putin, breaking him out of the isolation that the West had imposed on the Russian leader going back to February 2022. You have the American delegation at the United Nations in something I think was quite frankly embarrassing for the United States. When the General Assembly voted on resolutions regarding Ukraine, the United States joined with Russia, North Korea, Iran, and like 6 other countries to vote no, because the resolution correctly said that Russia was the aggressor. You have the launch of negotiations with Russia on normalizing relations, even though the elephant in the room, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, really has not been addressed. And you've had a series of gifts extended to the Russians. There's been no payback. I mean, the United States has received nothing of value in return, and you've not seen the Russian negotiating position adjust in a way that might make a settlement more likely. So I look at this and say, this is not the way to deal with the Kremlin. The Kremlin is just sitting back. Putin just expects more concessions from the United States. And this is sort of classic 101 criminology, how you do not deal with the Russians. It's time if President Trump and the administration are serious about trying to push for a settlement, they need to go and start using leverage that they have with Kremlin. Things like ask Congress for more military assistance for Ukraine, take steps working with the Europeans to close down the loopholes that make Western sanctions less effective than they could be in terms of impeding the development of the Russian economy. Talk to the G7, talk to the Europeans about moving to seize the Russian central bank's assets that have been frozen in the West, and take those funds and put them towards a fund that could be used to help Ukraine. All of those steps would be a way to signal Putin that if you do not accept a real negotiation and begin to negotiate seriously, if you continue the war, the military, the economic, the political costs of Russia are going to be high, and they're going to escalate. Thus far, though, for 3 months, the Trump administration has refused to employ that kind of leverage. And I think, it's going to be one reason why the mediation effort that Trump has talked about is now on a course to fail.
If, as you've discussed, the Trump administration's leniency towards Putin continues, the outcome of any potential settlement of the war may very well favor Russia. In this, and ultimately, if Putin achieves victory or a frozen conflict in the settlement of the war in Ukraine, what will this mean for NATO going forward? Particularly, what does this mean for the security of small state members along NATO's eastern and northern flanks, and including Canada?
Yeah. Well, if the Trump administration does not alter its course, the mediation effort, I believe, will fail. And then you have Russia and Ukraine, the sides far apart. The war continues. And quite frankly, I would like to see this war brought to an end, but I think it needs to be brought to the end by a just and durable settlement, a settlement that recognizes that there is an aggressor here, Russia, and a victim here, Ukraine. But I fear that absent that kind of settlement, and again, at this point in time, I think the Trump administration's approach is not going to succeed. The war will continue. And that's what I heard when I was in Kyiv last week, was that, look, if they cannot get a decent settlement, they're prepared to fight on, even though I think Ukraine's tired, they're weary of the war. But again, they don't see an alternative. So, what does that mean then for the West? I think the war continues. I think, though, it also signifies that, Russia remains a threat, but it's also maybe a bit of an opportunity here for the West. I think in Europe now, there's a growing recognition that Russia poses a military threat of the kind, that we haven't seen, since the bad days of the Cold War. Ukraine actually is buying Europe time. Europe has time now to rebuild its military. I mean, I think the estimates now, because of the damage that the Ukrainians have done to the Russian military, it would probably take the Russian military 3 to 5 years to reach a point where it could be a real threat to Europe. Europe should be using that time in a wise way to build up its own military capabilities. And I very much hope that Europe will continue to support Ukraine. This is actually something I would not have predicted 3 years ago. I believe actually Europe understands the importance of what the Ukrainians are doing, not just for Ukraine, but also for Europe's defense. So I think Europe will continue to support Ukraine. I fear, on the other hand, that in the Trump administration, there is not a recognition of what's at stake in this war, that there's not a recognition that if Russia wins, Russia becomes a much bigger threat. So I worry that, for example, the Trump administration may not be prepared to continue the kinds of assistance that the United States has provided over the past 3 years. And I think that's a mistake. And that's not just about Ukraine, but it's about from the point of view of American security. I don't think that the president understands really what's at stake here for American interests.
And that's all for today's episode. The Expert Series is released every Tuesday and Thursday, but we'll be taking a bit of a break this summer and releasing one podcast a week. If you want to learn more about the CDA Institute, follow us on social media, visit our website at cdainstitute.ca, or subscribe to our newsletter for the latest updates on Canadian defense and international security. If you have comments or feedback about what you heard in today's edition, email josh@cdainstitute.ca. I'm Josh Baum. Until next time.